Welcome to True You Ministries with pastoral counselor Stacy Echeverria. Stacy is a licensed pastoral counselor whose own journey has taught her the importance of having a safe place to discuss the harder issues of life. We're grateful that you've joined us for this week's broadcast. You can learn more about Stacy and her heartfelt desire to help people much like yourself who may be at a place of pain and confusion by calling her at 626-461-3344. That's 626-461-3344. Or feel free to email her at info@trueyouministries.com.
Welcome to True You Ministries, and I want to say hello to Debbie Maselli, my special guest on part 3, Ministry Wives whose families have left the ministry. Welcome to the show, Debbie. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Stacy. It's really great to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited about continuing our conversation around this particular topic. And so for today, I'd like to go more in depth in how ministry families can transition well as they're called out of ministry. I know that these transitions can be really painful. And I know that you and your family have experienced that as well. And so I'd love for our listeners to know how it can be less painful for them, and what are some practical things that they can do?
Well, part of what happens when you leave a ministry is especially if you're the senior pastor, the church tends to feel like it's a divorce. And in essence, it kind of is, because you've spent all this time together. They become attached to you. Many of them feel like you're like their family. And it becomes a relationship that is more than just a corporate relationship. Mm-hmm. And so, on the other hand, you're in a position of influence, and the current advice is probably something that the corporate world uses, is that you don't give people more than 6 weeks notice that you're leaving, because then you start to lose influence.
Right.
And so that's what we were told to do, and we went ahead and did what had been recommended to us, and I can't remember, it was 4 to 6 weeks that we noticed that we gave to the church. Mm-hmm. And in some ways that's good, because you don't have a long drawn out leaving, parting, but in other ways it doesn't allow people the opportunity to grieve.
Right.
So looking back on it, we were kind of conflicted. Should we have given them more time so that we allowed more opportunity for that? Should we have created some kind of opportunities to leave? I don't know that I have the answers for that part of it at this time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's good to be aware of that, because we need to understand how people are going to respond and react to our parting.
Right.
And so I wish that we had done that. On the back side of that, my husband felt like, well, when we leave, I mean, gosh, he had said at one point, don't you care about these people? I mean, we've invested 12 years with these people, and don't you care about their feelings? And I said to him, honey, none of these people are going to come with us when we leave. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And only people are going to call us are going to be the one couple that's really our best friends, and maybe a few others, less than 5.
Right. Well,
in reality, that's what happened. I had more people that called me because I had developed more one-on-one relationships with some of the women. So I did have contact with them. Some people didn't contact us because they were hurt and caught off guard. And they had to work through their own pain first. So the leaving ends up leaving one party feeling like you rejected them. Mm-hmm. And it leaves the party who left feeling like people have abandoned them.
Right.
So, and both parties kind of feel abandoned, but the church feels like, well, why aren't you staying? Especially when they weren't expecting it. Right. So it's really a hard transition for everybody involved, and just to be prepared ahead of time to know that you're going to feel abandoned by that 200 plus people, 225 people that you get one person or 3 people that call you.
Yeah.
It's disappointing for the pastor. And then the church feels like you just left us high and dry.
Right. Right. Yeah, in the churches that I've been at where there's been transition, I have to say that transitions were never done well. And and transitions are hard because there are losses that are involved in that, and so you do have to grieve those losses. You also have to manage your expectations as well, I think. That it's hard being it's hard being the lead pastor. There's a lot of expectation from the congregation. Even when even when you hear that it's the Lord that's creating this. The Lord has called them out. The Lord has called them to do something else, and it's still hard the congregation to wrap their brains around it, I think, or to embrace that. Because if you're at a church where the pastor's been there for 25 years, that's a long time. And that's not the norm, actually. I know about 3 to 5 years is the average where a pastor stays at a church. And I've been at churches where they've been there way longer than 3 to 5 years, and so there's an attachment that happens. But I think part of the issue too is, we the congregation attaches to a person rather than getting on board with what the Lord's doing. And what the Lord is doing is good. And I'm not minimizing or diminishing. Yeah, it is hard, even when the Lord is doing good things, right? To let go of that pastor and the pastor's family that you've become so attached to and become friends with. And I know that at one of the churches that I was at, what ended up happening was that when people would leave the church because the Lord has led them somewhere else, it was like, well, they're leaving the church, but they're not leaving the relationship. And I think that's important for people to remember as well. The relationship the relationship, I think, would stay the same. If you're friends with someone, you're friends with someone, and if the Lord has led them to go somewhere else for church, does that mean you stop being friends with them? And some of that comes up too. What are your thoughts on that?
There's a really good series by Bruce Wilkinson
Mm-hmm.
called The Dream Giver.
Mm-hmm.
And in that series, the video series is excellent. And I recommend it over the book. We're also used to videos now anyway, so we're
Right.
used to
Right.
being visual. But in that video series, he talks about that when you are working toward a goal and you accept this vision
Mm-hmm.
to go to a new place, it means that you will be leaving some people behind.
Right.
Typically, what happens is that he terms them you end up having border bullies. And these are
Mm.
people who say, "Oh no, you can't leave us.
Right.
You can't move away. That's
Right.
not okay because we still need you." And then you have border buddies, and those
Mm-hmm.
are people who walk to the border with you, and they encourage you.
Mm-hmm.
They stand by your side, and typically people who have been your friends may not be in your border buddy category.
Mm.
Your
Okay.
friends feel like you're abandoning them, so they kind of become your border bullies.
Oh.
And then you have this other category of people called border busters, and these are
Mm.
people who help you to break through that border.
Mm.
And those people aren't necessarily in your friends either. People
Mm-hmm.
who kind of were in the background before may end up being your border buddies or your border busters.
Mm-hmm.
Who are your close friends will tend to be in the border bully category because they're experiencing their own loss and they're going through their own grief.
Mm-hmm.
So when you do have a true vision from the Lord to go somewhere else, you are going to have all of these kinds of people in your life, and you're going to have surprises over who those people are.
Good point. Yeah, good point. That's helpful. Absolutely helpful. Yeah, good. All right. So, what else? I know that we've got some practical things here. Let's talk a little bit about when a pastor's called out uh, from the ministry that he's in or that she's in, and they're leaving. Can you talk a little bit about honoring the past?
You know, when you leave a ministry in good standing and you feel like that God really is calling you somewhere else, it's so easy to honor the past because you're leaving from a place of health and of good rapport, and it's really easy in those situations to honor the past. And in fact, you might actually, in the end up kind of glorifying the past because it was so good. Especially if something ends up being not good later on. However, when you leave because there was tension or conflict and it was just the best solution to leave, because sometimes it is best to remove yourself from a situation in order to allow for other things to take place.
Sure.
Either for you or for the other party. And we don't really want to admit that that's a good situation.
Right.
Because we don't want to admit that conflict can be that bad that somebody has to leave. So when that takes place, you have personal healing that you have to do when you leave.
Right.
And when we moved from our first ministry to the second ministry, we still have a good relationship with everyone who was in the previous ministry. We still have a good relationship with the people who took over for the ministry. We still support them. In fact, we still have communication with one of the spouses, I believe my husband does, excuse me, even though the person who took over for him has passed away. So we have long relationships with the organization and with the people who were there. When we left the last church, there was a lot of things going on behind the scenes that other people weren't aware of. We didn't tell everyone that's why we were leaving. We just said, we're pre-retiring. It was a nice, easy out for us.
Sure.
We didn't want to say, oh, God called us. It wasn't God calling us. We were just like, we're just done. Okay, this is the end of this chapter. We're done. It's not that we don't love everybody.
Right.
There's some people we had conflict with, but it wasn't everyone. But when we came, we were tired.
Right.
And so for us, we needed to find a place. My husband in particular needed to find a place where he could go and rest and kind of hide in the congregation. So we chose a church that was designed specifically for the de-churched and the unchurched. I had never heard of that kind of a church before, but I was really glad it existed. And I took a picture of my husband that first Christmas or Thanksgiving. I can't remember which day it was. And I took a selfie of us in church. And I just came across it the other day. And I looked at that picture and I thought, wow, how did I not see that my husband was depressed?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So we really needed that time to heal. That whole first year and a half we were here was really necessary for him to disengage himself from all the things that were expectations. He said later, sometimes people think, oh, you serve in the church. That's just such a blessing. It must really, your relationship with Jesus must be really good. He said, sometimes the church can pull you away from your relationship with Jesus Christ.
It's true.
So this whole first year and a half, we spent really reconnecting with Christ. I spent walking the beach and thanking God every day for just having a beautiful place to go walk the beach. So that I don't know if you can quantify or specify how healing takes place or what's required. I think it's individual for each person.
I agree. Yeah, I don't think there's a straight line, and I agree that it's individual for each person. I think there are certain aspects of healing that are the same, like certain components that are really required. I think, like forgiveness. I find that to be especially healing. I find it to be more detrimental if there's premature forgiveness. Right? That premature forgiveness, especially in the church where it's like, oh, you've got to forgive. Well, we know that. We do know that. But I think there's some resolve that's involved in that. There's some, I believe there's some heart work that needs to be done first before even approaching, the possibility of forgiveness and what all that means. And I've already done an episode on forgiveness, but one of the things I think that gets really twisted around is that, especially in the church, people think, well, forgiveness means reconciliation, and sometimes reconciliation is absolutely not possible, and forgiveness is separate. It's separate from reconciliation. The forgiveness piece has to do with the individual and the Lord, period. And it's releasing the power that anyone else has over us to make us feel the way that we do, that where our heart isn't right with God. So this really absolutely is about the individual and the Lord. Does the Lord desire a reconciliation in relationships? Absolutely. But there are times when that's not possible. And I know in my own life that has not been possible with a sibling. But I can still forgive him, and he's released, so that the Lord can do whatever he wants to do in my brother's life. I think that's really important. I think other things too, with part of the work in doing that heart work is looking at, and you touched on it, acknowledging the loss, going through this grief process, right? And what I've learned from myself with regard to grief is that there isn't a beginning, middle, and an end. It ebbs and it flows. That you're going to experience grief throughout life. That it's not a, hey, I'm done now, but it feels different. I think, depending on where you are in life, how old you are, the season of life that you're in. And I think the loss will be there, but it will feel differently, depending on where you're at in life. I know that with, and I have a couple of shows on grief also, but even with, the loss of a parent, or the loss of a job, or, even having to leave ministry, those losses are still there. We can't deny that the losses are there. So how are we going to grieve well, in that?
Well, when you leave ministry, there's a different thing than when you leave to go to another ministry.
Correct.
So when you leave to go to another ministry, it's like you've poured out the water of one cup and filled the water of another cup.
Right.
So your loss is different, and your loss is probably incremental and based on relationships, and with the way that we have all of our, social media and everything these days,
right.
We have the opportunity, and we have FaceTime, and we have Zoom, and we have so many ways to connect with people visually, and
right.
and the world is smaller because of airplanes, and sometimes that's good for us and sometimes it's not, but so we have ways to still stay connected to some of those people. But when you leave ministry, you are leaving something you've done your whole life. And for the men or women who've been the senior pastors, more men than women, that's why I said that first.
Sure.
Then
sure.
they come to this place where they're like, I don't even know what I'm going to do, or how are we going to do this? And then what is my identity? A man's identity is so much in his work.
Correct.
A woman's identity is in her relationships more. If her relationships, she doesn't feel as much loss.
Right.
But for a man, what am I going to do? And I've spent, like my husband spent 27 years or doing jail ministry or pastoring. He was in ministry for 27 years.
It's a long time.
Now what am I doing? And did I waste all my time those 27 years? Was that 27 years a loss? Was I wrong? Did I misread things in the beginning? These are the kind of questions that you go through as you grieve when you absolutely leave the profession.
Right.
So there's a difference when a man leaves ministry compared to just moves from one ministry to another.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I wanted to touch, and that's a great point too. And there absolutely is a difference in that. Something that I've been also looking at too, and our definition of ministry, that it isn't confined to the building, right? It's not confined to the building. We're
Mhm.
the church. It's the body of Christ.
Mhm.
That's the church. And so for me, I've been taking a different approach to ministry, and that is wherever I am, there's an opportunity to minister. That's ministry. Do I need anything more official than that? Not at this point in my life, for sure.
Mhm.
I've had, some negative experiences being involved in ministry in my local church. I wasn't, a lead pastor or anything like that. I was a ministry leader. And when we left the church, we were called out of the church, but some things happened, and it didn't end well,
Mhm.
and there's still grief in that for me. And
Mhm.
that was 7 years ago, 8 years ago now. And, that's an unfortunate thing. So, for me, what happened was I got burned out
Mhm.
in serving in the church, and I didn't want to anymore. And the Lord has not called me back to doing that yet. And so it's not like I'm just sitting back and not doing anything. I look at the work of counseling that I've been called to as a way to minister to a lost, hurt, and broken world, and to minister to people within the body of Christ as
Mhm.
well. So I think too, for people that have been in ministry, the way that your husband has, for 27 years, now it's maybe there's an opportunity for him to allow himself to be open to how does the Lord want to bring ministry back to him, and what is it going to look like?
I think probably that's not as hard for him as it has been for me.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
every person goes through this transition in their own way.
Yeah.
Um, so for me, when we first moved, I said, I told my husband, I said, I'm still in with Jesus, but I'm not in with church people anymore.
I hear you. I That totally resonates for me.
So that for me, I think I've had to come to a place where I've had to realize that part of the conflict that happened, I I probably closed off part of my heart even to the Lord and didn't realize that I had done that.
Mm,
So I'm in the process of having discussions with God about that right now.
hmm.
Um, my husband, on the other hand, is being careful not to do things because he doesn't want to jump into things that are not his to jump into. So when you go to one of the things that happens is when you leave a church and when you move anywhere, and if you're not in ministry or in the military or in a first responder kind of situation where you have an automatic social
Right.
because
Right.
it's such a
Yeah,
small, it's a micro society kind of. So if
right.
you're not going to a micro society, then usually it takes 3 to 5 years for you to get to a place where people know that you're in their realm and they kind of wonder why aren't you on my calendar after about 2 years? And it takes another year for them to kind of get you on their calendar.
Yeah.
So that then becomes that last 2 years, 3 to 5 years becomes a time where you actually make friends, where you actually
Hmm.
start to have a relationship with people.
Right.
The same thing happens with the church organization when
Hmm.
people, we didn't necessarily, in fact, I don't think we even told anybody at first that we used to be pastor family because you don't want people going, oh, they're a pastor family.
Right.
So, let me put you in this little box with expectations that I have for you. Um,
Right. Right.
so we didn't tell people at first. And then even after we told people, we just didn't really, we didn't want it. We weren't there to take over anything. We weren't there to try and influence people to be a certain thing. We were there to participate.
Hmm.
So we've been at this church for about 2.5 years. And we just now started saying, this is what I can do if you are interested.
Mm.
And when we did that, the pastor said, it's really good that you did that, because people need to see you and know who you are before they know whether or not they want to, utilize your services and
Yes.
utilize what your gifts and stuff. So
Yeah.
true to the 2 to 5 year issue. We'd been there 2 years before we said, this is what we can do. And so there's this big lag time that you're going to experience when you leave
Mm-hmm.
ministry.
Mm-hmm.
You feel like you have community.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not prepared for that big lag time, there can be a lot of loneliness in those first 3 years. And a lot of feeling like nobody values me. And I've seen pastors that tried to leave somewhere and go somewhere else. And I was a pastor here for so and so many years, and this is what I can do, and you should be able to use me. And when they do that, you feel like, whoa, dude, time out. You're like way too pushy.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
there's a lot of adjustment that a pastor has to do as he leaves ministry and the pastor family, that you're not the top of the totem pole anymore. In fact, you're at the bottom now.
Right. Hard place to be.
Yes.
Hard place to be. And maybe it's a good place to be. It allows them to rest as well, and then see what God is going to do. I like what you said. It brings to mind, there's a friend of ours where when you were talking about, that 3 to 5 year lag, right? And that, it takes time when you leave a church and you're in a new church, not just if you're a ministry family, but just when we were called out and then we were led to a different church. I mean, we are at a church that is exploding. It's just huge. I don't like mega churches. That's not considered, our pastor doesn't consider the church a mega church. That was never, the vision, but it's become one because his teaching is just so spot on, and people are wanting that. So I was like, yeah, I'm not called to serve here. Not right now. It's just too big. I just, so I was like, yeah, how are we ever going to get connected with people here? And, I'm from that place of, I just don't want to serve in the institution, if you will. But I do want to get to know people. And I think allowing ourselves that time and not rushing and getting ahead of God, is really the way to go. And that, obviously develops patience in us and maybe a little bit of self-control. But for me, what's been really helpful was plugging in with a small group. Mm-hmm. And getting to know the people that way. And we finally found a small group where we're like, oh, these are our people. Yes. Like, this is our tribe, if you will. And it's not a small group. It's like 23 people. It's not a small group. But there's such intimacy in that larger group where I'm going, wow. And that's, the leaders do really well, or the facilitators do. And it's just a really great, mix of people. And so I think about, a friend of ours who is, he's been trying to figure out where to connect in church and all this and that, and after a number of months he's like wanting to teach and stuff like that, and my husband's been talking with them, and my husband keeps saying the same thing: they don't know you. Mm-hmm. They don't know you, and it's going to take time. Mm-hmm. Right? And I think that's the piece that people struggle with. It's like, well, with any relationship, it takes time. It's baby steps in developing that trust and being able to see, oh, this is what this person can offer, and having them call that out and say, hey, how about helping out here? And, I think too, there's something to be said about humility in that, yeah, maybe you are called to teach, but maybe the Lord wants you to do something else first. And being willing to do that.
Well, in my writers group, they say, writing is a long process. And it's
Yes,
not a
it
long
is.
process just because of the writing part, because you can have something that you wrote in 30 days. They have
Yeah.
these things, write your book in 30 days. You can get your book written in 30 days. You can,
Sure. Sure.
but you can't get it published in 30 days. And it might
Nope.
take 3 years to get published what took 30 days to write.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
you might be ready to move to a new place, but people aren't necessarily ready to receive you in that new place yet.
Right. That's a good point. Absolutely. And that's because they don't know you. They don't know you, right?
Or
And
because of their process. They might just have a long process.
exactly. Exactly. And it really is about trusting the Lord's timing in all of that anyway. It's hey, what is he going to do in that waiting also? I think we tend to want to bypass that. I know for me in the waiting, that's where I've learned the most. It's where I've grown the most, and the Lord has shown me the most. In the waiting, and I appreciate those waiting times. I'm a person where I'm like, go go go, do this, get it done, blah blah. And it's like, as I've gotten older, I've seen the value in waiting.
The other thing that we discovered early on, because we had moved so frequently, I was in the military, then we moved because my husband was in school, and then we moved because of a job, and then we moved because of a house. And so we usually spent about 5 to 6 years everywhere that we went before we moved again. So we were just getting to have our really solid friendships when we get uprooted again.
Yeah.
And one thing that we found when we moved places is that we needed to connect with the people who were the outlier people, who were the fringe people, because they were the ones who didn't have a generational family members in the area. They were the ones who didn't grow up there and have all of their friends from grade school and high school and college and whatever. They were the ones who didn't have a lot of relationships. So we found the people who didn't have a lot of relationships. And those are the people who we made friends with for those first 2 to 3 years before you're really connected with other people who are in the area.
Right.
And that really helped us, because they might not have ended up being our friends long term, but it allowed us to be able to have the connections that we needed, the human connections, the human contact that we needed for that, initial startup time. And that was really beneficial, and we found that to be true every single place that we've lived.
Yeah.
Find the fringe people when you move, especially when you're a senior pastor. You usually have to leave the area that you were in before and go to a new area, so you lose all of your relationships. And one of you is going to be more inclined to have relationships sooner than the other one.
True.
Everybody has their own, every individual has their own different need for relationships. So just be patient with each other. And like, my husband didn't really want to have a small group, and I said, well, I need one. So I went and became part of a small group for women.
Yeah.
I didn't get to stay there very long because my job ended up interfering with that. I did some other things that were online then, and he still wasn't ready to have relationships. And
right.
then when he was finally able to have relationships, he felt like I can dip my toes in the relationship water right now, but I don't want to do it every week. And I said, well, I don't really necessarily want to do it every week either. How about we find out if they have one that meets every other week? And they did. And we said, well, wouldn't it be really fun to have like a breakfast club where you guys go out to breakfast and only meet every other week? And the person organizing the small group says, it's a great idea. Why don't you guys think of that? And we looked at each other. We said, well, that's a typical answer from somebody in leadership in a church,
Right.
Eventually, we did end up starting it. We started something called the Breakfast Club. And,
I love it.
It's delightful. In fact, the first 3 months that we were there, I don't even think we were there 3 months. It might have been 6 weeks. 2 of the guys got baptized.
Oh, wow.
One of the couples my husband is actually going to marry this coming year. So,
nice.
It's been really neat to see what God's been doing in all these men's lives. They've been really open and genuine, and they are really treasured people in our lives now, because we decided to meet our own need with something that was not as heavy as it. Let's all study Romans. So, not to say that we couldn't do that, but we just
Right.
where we were at, and
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
you know, get in touch with what your needs are. That's a great way to start looking at not trying to speak into somebody else's life, but what is your need? And maybe God
Mhm.
is using your need to make an opportunity to meet somebody else's need at the same time.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. It's funny that you mentioned, maybe not studying the book of Romans, and I'm like, well, my church has been in the book of Romans for like going on 3 years right now. So doing a really deep dive, which I so appreciate. But of all the books that you could have named, that's just so
Awesome.
funny. I love it. I love it. Wednesday nights it's Hebrews. So anyway, yeah, we're doing deep dives right now. But yeah, I love what you've shared, Debbie. I think this is really great. And as we wrap up, is there one last thing that you'd like to share with our listeners? One last, maybe bit of advice or some wisdom.
If you are a pastor or pastor's wife who's thinking about leaving or who has left ministry and you feel alone and you feel like you just don't know how to move forward in life, then please give me a call, contact somebody else who's interested in being real with you, because sometimes people aren't ready to be real. They feel like oh my gosh, you can't ever leave the pastorate. You can't leave your calling. And
Yeah,
so find somebody who's real, and it might surprise you who the real people are. It might be the guy who's pumping your gas for you.
that's true. That's true. I love that. Thank you. Yeah, and Debbie's website is Neume, Neume 180.com, or you can email her at neume180@gmail.com. Debbie, as always, it's such a pleasure being with you and having these conversations. And Debbie and I are friends, and even though we live on opposite ends of the country, we're able to have wonderful conversation. I'm so glad that you were able to be with us today. Thank you so much, Debbie.
Thank
And I wanted to leave you with a scripture, Isaiah 43, 2 through 3. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. And what a wonderful comfort that is to know that when we are going through troubled times, right? Troubling times, difficult times, and He's with us. He's not left us. And so I just love that. And for those of you that have been listening and watching and you've walked away from the Lord or you're contemplating coming toward Him, do that today. We are in such troubling times right now in this world. We don't know what end is up, but the Lord is the one that keeps us steady on the road. He is the one that is our salvation. He is the one that has answers for everything that's troubling us. So give me a call, reach out to me. I'm at 626-461-3344, or even contact Debbie. I'm sure, either Debbie or myself, we'd love to hear from you. Time is short right now. We don't know when the Lord's going to come back. So don't waste any more time thinking about it. Just reach out to us. We're happy to speak with you. And I want you to know that the Lord is waiting with open arms. So thank you again for being with us today.
You've been listening to True You Ministries with pastoral counselor Stacy Echeverria. Stacy is a licensed pastoral counselor whose own journey has taught her the importance of having a safe place to discuss the harder issues of life. You can learn more about Stacy and her heartfelt desire to help people, much like yourself, who may be at a place of pain and confusion by calling her at 626-461-3344. That's 626-461-3344. Or feel free to email her at info@trueyouministries.com. That email once again is info@trueyouministries.com. Thank you for tuning into today's show, and we'll see you next week at the same time. And may God richly bless you.